My name is Roecher. I'm doing something with threat intelligence at DCSO.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm a data scientist at DCSO in the threat intelligence team, which is led by Dror.
Yep, and we wanted to share with you today a report on the project which we did over the last, like 8 to 9 months. And actually it all started with a simple question, like who gives the best bang for the buck? So talking about money or basically a little bit more precisely, which dollar vendor best complements our existing APT detection solutions on our network sensors. So we set out on a mission and defined a project and started to work and try to answer that question.
Thanks. So this project felt like an adventure. There were lots of ups, quite a few downs, a lot of emotions, some tears even. So we thought today we'd like to present it to you as a mission with a primary objective, which was, like George just said, identify the best TI vendor for our purposes. And we also included a few secondary objectives, which were to compare the TI vendors using a standard format, build some open source tooling around it, develop some metrics to compare these vendors and their data, and finally share the experience and knowledge with you today and hopefully in the future as well. So today we'll go through the various steps of that mission. We'll start by going over the context, some of the literature around it. Next, we'll talk about some of the expectations we had going in and how we expected our end result to look like. We'll talk about how we selected the different TI providers, how we eventually got the data from them, how we stored it, the data magic we performed on the data, and finally the takeaways and learnings that we had at the end.
Yeah, so maybe to just give you a little bit of background, when we talk about understanding indicators or understanding threat intelligence, there's obviously a lot of previous work, and most notably, obviously, this stuff from Alex Pinto and Kyle Maxwell, which started roundabout in 2014 with the presentations at DEF CON. So that's the so-called tick test, TI, intelligence testing, quite interesting tooling also released around that, and it's very much focused on quantitative comparison of indicators of compromise from various sources. And a current version of the tick test was just released earlier this year, I believe around January. Version 2 of the tick test was released, and it's always good looking at that stuff if you are into understanding indicators. Another quite interesting piece of work was done by Pavel Pawlinsky and Andrew Kompanek of CertPL. They published it around 2016, and they were also looking at evaluating TI feeds on a large scale and over a long time. And one of the core messages or core results was actually we do need a framework because doing all this comparison and analysis is quite difficult, and that's also one part where we took off. So if you're into the field, have a look at the previous research, always good knowing what's already out there. So the title states basically analyzing vendors of indicators of compromise or of TI. It's not the same, and we can go into all the details over beer tonight. And for our purposes, the best one for our purposes. So it's important to understand a little bit about our purposes. We operate network sensors. From an architecture point of view, you can think of a managed IDS, which sits in our customer networks. So with our customers, we have multiple sensors with each customer at various locations. They run a version of Suricata. We have some self-developed detection capabilities on them, and we can push out indicators of compromise. We can push out the Suricata rules. We can push out Yara rules. We do file extraction on these sensors to analyze what these sensors see. They are passive, so they don't break any sort of encryption, and they don't pose an operational threat, which is also very important to us. They just see a copy of that. And So that is the stack we are operating, and we are already doing quite a lot of things with these sensors, and we set out on a mission to find yet another vendor to supplement our existing detection capabilities. If we want to supplement our existing detection capabilities, it is very important to also understand our threat model. Like, what do we want to achieve with that? Which vendors or which threats are our customers actually facing? And we were founded 3 years ago with a very strong focus on what's called APT stuff. So incident response and TI around APTs. So our customers are facing the traditional Chinese espionage campaigns, a little bit of the Russian originated espionage activities, and then to a lesser degree some of the other ones that we see. So we're not really interested in the current Emotet spam campaigns, for example, but very much focused on the APT. Last slide on the context. It's basically how we assume networks are working. We are assuming that they are breached. We are assuming our customer networks are breached, and we try to detect things at a later kill chain phase. So, for example, when there is lateral movement going on, when things are being copied from left to right, when data is being exfiltrated, when there is command and control communication being established, when later stage malware is being dropped. So all of that we try to detect with our solution. So what we were looking for was a vendor who would provide us with additional capabilities in detecting these kind of later stage activities of adversaries on our network sensors at our customers. So that is really what we were targeting at, a very, very focused and precise questions we were trying to answer. So, Alicia.
Thanks. So that was context. Now we'll talk you through some of the ideas we had going in about how we wanted the results to look like. So we started by asking some of the researchers and analysts at DCSO, what does a good TI feed look like in your opinion, for the purposes that we had at the time, which is focused on APT indicators? Those were some of the answers they gave us. So low false positive rate, high quality context attached to the indicator, some information about the kill chain stage, targets, was the indicator delivered in a timely fashion, is there information regarding time to live, is the campaign the indicator is attached to still active, and other points as well. That's all great. But how do you go from that list of requirements to metrics that you can then compare across the different vendors? So our first sketch looked like that. We thought there were about 3 large categories that would best represent the areas we needed to have information on in order to make our decision about which TI vendor to go with. Machine readability is extremely important to us. As Roy mentioned, the IOCs that we're looking at eventually needed to go onto a sensor. Information analysis, by that we mean the quality of the indicators and do they really suit our needs. And finally, real-world performance. How do these indicators perform on our sensors? Will they make the sensors blow up? Will there be too many false positives? Are they picking up useful information?
So what we then did is we went into each of these categories and defined various metrics for these categories, and said, okay, we want to have a visual representation. We want to make a very clear message within each category. What is actually going on? Very simple, very visual based. That was what we set out to do, and maybe I'm spoiling here a little bit, but we didn't manage to do it like that. So that's why we subtitled this call, this presentation, Trial and Tribulations, because we didn't really succeed with all of that. So we then went into the provider selection phase, and at this point I need to tell you this is the only time you will actually see any logos and names. After that, everything is just doing with random vendor 1 to vendor X. We had great support from a team at DCSO who do vendor scouting, and so they did a lot of scouting, and they came up with a list of around about 25 potential vendors, which might be interesting. And we started contacting them. Some thought this was obviously spam or a hoax and never ever replied. We came down to a list of around 11 vendors who were of interest, who were also interested in working with us, who replied to our emails. And we got in contact with them. We started with a very short, fact sheet. What kind of company is this? What is their offering? What is their background? Just to do a little bit of preliminary work and a little bit of background checking, more or less. Then some of these vendors, during our discussion, said, "Oh, you know what? At the end of the day, we believe we don't have a product which suits your needs. We do have indicators, but not for APT, or we don't have a label which is APT, whatever." Some of the vendors also said, "Oh, we do have the data you're interested in, but we are not going to give it to you for testing, comparing, or for doing a POC." So that at the end of the day, out of the 25, through a down selection process, it came down to 4, which actually had interesting data and were willing to share that data with us for this POC purpose. And I'm not going to tell you which 4 these are at the end of the day. Sorry for that.
Not even over peers.
Well, we would be breaching NDAs and things like that, so really needs to stop at that. So, Alicia.
Yeah. So at this point, we have the data, and we need to figure out how to store it. First of all, one of our wishes was that we would get the data, line all the vendors up, and then turn them on and have 3 weeks where we're just ingesting data from these 3 or 4 vendors. And at the end of that, we'd be able to compare them and be like, okay, this one delivered that IOC first, that one delivered that many more IOCs compared to that one. That didn't work out. There were some delays in negotiations, some implementations took a while, and then we also had some differences on the level of the data itself. Like some vendors offered reports, and others had IOCs that were being updated at much more frequent intervals than the reports. So, for example, a report would come out maybe once every few days versus multiple IOCs being released every few hours. It didn't really make sense to sort of focus ourselves only on a 2-3 period that would potentially take a few of those vendors out of competition. So what we did, we used this window wherever it was possible to get an idea of, okay, how would it look like if we had these 2 vendors at the same time on our sensors? But we also took into account some historic data too, and tried to work with it in the best possible way, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. Next, like we said at the beginning, we were interested in, well, we hoped that we would be able to plug all these vendors into a common platform with a common data format in which we could compare them. So we discussed potential solutions, and the first one that came up was the MISP, which we're big fans of. We also have our own MISP project and developers in the house that do the MISP Dockerize, which is a Docker version of the MISP. And the MISP has some great features, like you can correlate indicators. So an indicator that's been published by one vendor would then appear as correlated to another vendor if that other vendor also had it. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. Like I said, there were differences not only in the frequency of the updates, but also the structure of the data itself. We weren't able to build a one-to-one mapping between the data that the different vendors gave us and the MISP format. And I don't think this is a drawback of the MISP. This is simply, we couldn't find a solution out there, and we didn't want to put all our time into developing plugins for the various vendors, very well knowing at the end that we would only go with one, perhaps 2. Do you have anything to add? No?
Oh.
All right, so at this point, let's have a look at our mission. Unfortunately, we've had to drop. So compare TI vendors using a standard format failed, but we still have other objectives that were online.
Yeah. So we actually ended up really analyzing each vendor by itself for its own, with a lot of Python code Alicia wrote using Jupyter notebooks, which are so difficult to share.
They're custom, well, they're vendor specific, so yeah. Great. All right, so at this point we have the data, and like perhaps I should say a little bit more. So I worked on the data in these Jupyter notebooks, and these were sometimes data that came through the MISP API, but in other cases it was just a raw data dump of JSONs or sticks that I was just worked and extracted the information I needed in order to compare it across different vendors, but more of that soon. Great. So before we talk about the metrics, I'd like to quickly point out what I mean by APT IOC in this context. So I'm new to cybersecurity. My background is maths and data science and other fields. So I inherently don't really know what an APT IOC is. So I'm reliant on tags, on labels. Something needs to tell me in the data that this is APT. So for the purpose, well, we decided to go with that definition. So for the purpose of our project, APT IOCs were IOCs that somehow had perhaps a threat actor attached to them in the data, or any other kind of metadata that could be labeled as APT. So some of the metrics we considered were the total number of APT IOCs that the vendor provided, how many of those IOCs were derived from open source intelligence, the overlap with our own internal data feeds, how quickly the vendors delivered those IOCs, if they delivered the same as other vendors within the POC, the geographic focus, so where were these IOCs coming from? So looking at the sources, and also what was the split? Like, were we talking about network indicators or files? Yeah. So a bit more, okay. So we'll start with, I won't go into every single metric. We picked out a few, one of them being timeliness. So how often was a vendor first to report compared to others? So you can see, for example, vendor 2 reported over 3/4 of the time an IOC first. That was one view that we were interested in, and eventually became part of the scorecard.
Yeah, but if you look at timeliness, I mean, there are more questions to ask on the who was first. When we talk about APTs, and if you've ever done APT incident response or analysis, you probably know that. We are usually talking about long-lasting campaigns which have been with the customer for quite a while. I mean, we've seen instances where customer were breached 9 years ago, and it took them 9 years to actually find traces of these breaches. So if vendor A tells me about an indicator 2 or 3 weeks before vendor B, in our specific context, is that really relevant or not? So that's the kind of question we were asking ourselves. So if I'm trying to catch Emotet as a spam campaign, which is over within 45 minutes, then 2 or 3 weeks is way too long. If I'm talking about APT campaigns, maybe the time dimension is not that important. And if vendor B, who reports second, adds more context that helps me understand this information much better, maybe it is even worth waiting these 2 or 3 weeks and go for the copycat, who's just using the data and adding more context. So if you look at previous work, I always found this focus on dominance or who was first quite interesting, because no one challenged the first equals better assumption. It's just an assumption everyone makes, that first equals better. But if you look at use cases and you come up with your own use cases for using indicators, do challenge that assumption.
Another metric we considered was false positives. So we shared this information back with the vendors themselves, and the false positives sparked the biggest discussions. Obviously, no vendor wants to be told they have any false positives. Rather than sort of, in this case, for example, you see vendor 4 on the right has a higher instance of IP false positives, and these were false positives that we detected using our own lists. That was not so much, I would say, that's a bad feed. It was more for us a lens to understand the feed better. Like, what were the indicators that were popping up as false positives from that feed? And we discovered, for example, in that case, that many of those were IP addresses from content delivery networks. So it was more a process. I think it's worth pointing out at this point that we use these metrics both to question like our own methods, like how are we measuring false positives, but also how are these feeds building, putting together their data. Perhaps they have a different understanding of what should be in a feed versus us. Yeah. Finally, this is the last metric we want to present. This one was, so you can see it's geographic focus versus the data types. So for example, if you look at the top left corner, that feed has a higher, is more specialized in Chinese indicators, threat actors, and well, below their network and file. So you can see, for example, yeah, that vendor 1 is more specialized in network indicators from China, and perhaps vendor 2 has a heavier focus on file indicators. Unfortunately, we had to classify some of them as unknown because there wasn't enough metadata attached to the indicators. Again, this was a challenge of trying to fit these different feeds into the same box. But still, this was a lens with which we were able to look at the different feeds and try and make our decision.
Yeah. Quick question. Who can spot the antivirus vendor in here? Anyone? Where is the antivirus? There's a traditional antivirus vendor. Just shout out loud. Windows 3, why? Files. Yeah. So exactly. So when we're talking about file indicators, what they usually do, they just dump a massive amount of MD5 hashes at you. And it's quite easy to produce millions of MD5 hashes. To be honest, we found them less useful than the network-based indicators. So just another thing. But this picture is actually the one where we gained the most insight out of in really understanding what the vendors are providing to us. So from all the analysis that we did, for me as a security analyst, this one is the one where I said, okay, now I understand the difference between the different vendors. Everything else before that, like this one is first, there's this percentage of overlap, they're using a lot of open source. All the other stuff we did, they have a high false positive rate. All the other stuff we did is interesting, but for me, this is the real beef. It's like, okay, now I know that vendor in the top left, in the bottom left corner, sorry, has a very strong focus on Iranian threat actors. If I then go back to my threat model, my threat model tells me, for example, I'm doing petrochemicals. And whenever I do petrochemicals, from a business perspective, I know in my threat model that I'm a target for Iranian threat actors. So if I would be in the petrochemical branch, I would very much look at or start talking to this vendor about, okay, maybe it makes sense to include this information into my overall TI program. Because then I'm really taking the right approach into thinking about capabilities. And then I can see, okay, if I have this vendor with Iranian information, how much of that is unique? Or do I have that information in one of the others too, right? But that is the correct approach into understanding what you actually get.
Great. So, mission completed. At this point, we focus, well, yes, we made a decision based on some of, well, the metrics, but also other aspects. For example, machine readability, we didn't describe with metrics. That was more feel and actual hands-on. Did it work? Did it not? What were the problems? Similarly, with real-world performance, we didn't go into any detail today, but that was also, we did some tests and
okay.
yeah, that's, I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah. Great. Unfortunately, there were a few things that we had to abort. Like we already said, we weren't able to use the standard format. Unfortunately, that also compromised the open source tooling aspect of the project because so much of the code was specific to the vendor. We were able to develop metrics, at least for ourselves, to help us in making the decision. And yeah, we still have one more open point.
Yeah, actually sharing stuff, which we're doing right now. But maybe let's come to some of the takeaways. We split this up in takeaways for vendors. I hope some TI vendors are present, and takeaways for blue teamers and takeaways for researchers. So there's multiple takeaway slides. With the vendors, sometimes we had the impressions the vendors weren't eating their own dog food. Like, they made it so difficult to work with the API that we really believed that, that no one is using that. There were instances of nested APIs with nested data, which was then packed, where you had to use multiple certificates to get to the data. I mean, it was just XML wrapped in JSON kind of stuff. If you're a vendor, please start using your own products because then you will feel the pain. Spend more data, more time with data people. That's one of my big lessons that I learned. Spending more time with data people is well invested time because they make you think about what you really want to get out of data and make you be very specific. Document. Also going through the vendors, the quality of the documentation was quite variable. There was very good documentation, there was very bad documentation. There was even one vendor who, after we finished the project, approached us with, "Oh, you used the wrong API." And we're like, "Yeah, well, why don't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us beforehand? We told you what we were trying to do." Yeah, well, we forgot, we didn't know. So sort of like understand your product is also something which we try to recommend to vendors and make it easy to compare to others. So everyone's trying to add some sort of magic, my own sauce, and I'm trying to hide and trying not to give trying not to be clear and precise about the data. So our impression was they make it deliberately hard to compare them to each other. And that should not be the case. At some point I was reminded at the mobile phone tariffs. Have you ever tried to compare mobile phone tariffs? I mean, it's become much easier now with flat rates and stuff. But like 5 or 10 years ago, it was the mobile phone providers made it deliberately hard to compare tariffs, and it's basically the same here. And the last one for the vendors, and this is I really love this picture, and I have to give credit to the author of that. So I was told about that triangle by Ralf Wirowski of Bayer, of the SOC of Bayer. Basically, there's 3 dimensions: fast, accurate, and complete, and you can only choose 2 of these. So if you're a vendor, tell us where in this triangle your product is. Are you fast and complete? Then we know to expect inaccuracy. If you're accurate and fast, we know we must not expect completeness, for example. So it's quite important to understand that, and really makes a lot of sense to think about it. So much for the vendor side. Now, I assume there are more blue teamers in here than vendors. So this is more for the blue teamers. Spend more time with data people. Again, it is every minute invested talking to data people like Alicia is well invested, because they will make you think about your problem in a different way, and they have a different point of view, and they challenge you, so it really is something which you need to get into. Then, of course, we all know indicators of compromise are not the real TI stuff, so try to move up on the abstraction level of threat intelligence. try to understand the threat model, and then from the threat model, the adversaries and their TTP. So look into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example, to model that. And then you can work at a very different level instead of just hunting IP addresses and that. And then also, accept that failure is part of the process. Also quite frustrating, but a good takeaway and a good learning. And again, having a look at the triangle, figure out what you want. Think about your use cases. Do you need fast and accurate data, for example, to block a phishing campaign? Or do you want a complete and accurate picture, and then you can live with delay? So really understand what you want to get out of it, and then once you know what you need and what you're expecting, go to the vendor you're talking to or to the provider and ask them to place their product, and then you can see if it matches or not. It's very simple. It's a very, very simple check, like that. And then maybe for the data people, security researchers.
Can I step in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
So from a data scientist standpoint, really think about your use cases. And this isn't just for the data people in the room, it's also for you as a team if you're working on this problem. It really helps when you have clear use cases in mind. That way you can make decisions, like maybe decide not to work with a vendor right at the beginning rather than try and fit everything into the same box. Accept that you can't measure everything. It's okay to drop fields. If you know what you need the fields for, then just ignore the others. At least that was my view on that. And also revisit the question, what makes an IOC APT? So this kept coming back during the project, and there were some researchers that really did not like the idea of labeled data as being an APT IOC. They said, yeah, sure, but there's also lots of stuff out there that isn't labeled. What about that? I'm not saying there's a right answer or a wrong answer. Try and spend time on that question and come up with a working definition, something that works for you, and roll with it.
Yeah. Like one of our colleagues, he kept saying, "Oh, well, you have a lot of bias in your whole approach because you're looking at labeled data," which, from his point of view, is correct. So basically, we were more judging the capability of vendors to label data as APT data, and now a completely different approach, which might also work, is take unlabeled data or take labeled data and throw all the labels away, just take the indicator and try to establish for yourself whether that is APT related or not. I mean, that is a completely different question, very, very difficult probably to achieve, because you then need to think about, okay, how do I do data enrichment on, for example, a domain, which gives me enough information to determine an aptishness. So from a score from 0 to 1, how aptish is an indicator would be a completely different approach, which we did not try to achieve in here, but would also be very interesting.
Sure. It would be a project in itself.
A larger project, yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we completed our primary objective, failed on a couple, but also developed some metrics, and we're here sharing this with you, and we're happy to answer questions either now or afterwards.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. I'm glad you got in the mention that a threat data feed is not threat intelligence. It's very, very important to keep that in mind. For most companies, for a lot of companies, any data feed from any threat intelligence vendor will drown your security people. Remember this before you start assessing what you guys presented. They have the organization in place to turn data into intelligence, to enrich, and to evaluate, and that makes it valuable to them. Sorry, just had to get that out before we went into questions.
You're right. Yeah.
Questions?
Hi. Have you tried to evaluate these vendors based on the number and quality of TTPs they provide compared to IOCs?
they don't really provide TTPs. And even, I mean, we went up on the scale. So we also asked them to provide Yara rules, and we also asked them to provide Suricata rules. But as soon as you leave the basis of indicators and rich data, it becomes even more complex and more difficult, and they simply lose out. So there's almost no vendor doing good Yara rules. Most of them just copy, I hope I can say this, Florian Roth's open source Yara rules, and then push them out again. We did it about a year ago. What we did a very thorough look at the APT reports of various vendors. There was a different project, not this one, where we looked at the reporting capabilities and how vendors reacted to requests for intelligence. So when we asked them questions, intelligence-related questions, how was the reply? And we had a set of standardized questions and went through vendors and gave them all the same questions and rated their replies. And in there, we did see a very big variance in reporting quality and also in replying quality too. But that was something completely different.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, quite interesting. One of the questions I had, I might have missed it at the start, but I was wondering if you also thought about looking into trust communities or ISACs and information shared over there, because it's also quite interesting to see as well on timeliness, quality, and the other measurables you tried to achieve on how are these how far are these compared to the other vendors? Because in the end, it's all a decision about, okay, in one way, maybe you spend money, in another way, maybe you spend time and energy, and in which way is there quite a balance between those? Yeah,
so we're active in some of the sharing circles, and we do see also in there, they are very different. Each one has their own pros and cons. But for this project, we were actually explicitly looking for commercial vendors to supplement our existing solutions. So it was very out of scope to have a look at the sharing circles, trust communities, OPSEC, and things like that.
To your point on spending time with data scientists, how much time do you usually spend on visualization? Because you mentioned that this one visualization of the reporting was like the best thing you had in the entire project to evaluate stuff. So one of the things I'm always wondering is I usually people have a ton of data, but looking at data that humans can actually understand it is quite complicated, and I'm kind of wondering how much time should you spend on visualizing your data to actually extract good things?
Yeah, not enough is the way I would say. I mean, yeah, I think if I could go back and do it again, I would probably do it in sprints and like share the visualizations, get feedback, because I had that with a few, and I shared that with a few people, and they were like, "What are you trying to share here?" So we stripped it down, and in the end, we had maybe 4 or 5 that were really sending a message. Yeah, so I did spend time, but you could spend a lot more. And it's really the feedback, I think that's important, because you become blind to the data, and you have to really think about the message. And I think that's quite hard as a data scientist, sort of coming from a different background, not really, in some ways it's good because it means I have a fresh perspective, but on the other hand, I'm not sure what is the story we're trying to tell here. Like, what is the important part of this visualization? What do I really want to highlight? And I really need the feedback from the security researchers on that.
Do you have any literature on diagrams or something for something like that?
Yes. Can I get back to you afterwards? Or I can share it. It's one of those moments where I'm having a blank on the name.
Yeah. Well, there's a classic on visualization of security data. That's Rafi Marti, security visualization. That is actually the only printed book that I know that deals with visualization of security data. I don't know if there's anything else out there, but that's Rafael Marti.
But there's also, there are a lot on information visualization, which also apply. But I'll get back to you on that. Yeah.
And that's it. We're out of time. If you have further questions, please catch them later. You will be around?
Yeah, we will be around. One last thing, picture credit. There was this wonderful background picture of Aurora Borealis over a Norwegian fjord. It's Creative Commons share alike by attribution, so we're doing the attribution. And our presentation is under the same license. Thank you.
Thank you.